we are thrilled to kick off today our 7th annual Europe Week. It's hard to believe. And we're really glad that you could all join us on this Monday at lunchtime for our time zone. Of course, we have a few different time zones represented, and we're glad you could all make it. I am encouraging you to attend all of our Europe Week events. Please check our website, europe.unc.edu, as usual, /Europe Week, where you'll find all the details and how to register. It's going to be exciting tomorrow. For example, you can follow along and make Norwegian meatballs with us, both a vegetarian and a non-vegetarian version. So we are offering lots of exciting things this week. But we are kicking off with a very good friend of the center, Ambassador Boris Ruge. I'm thrilled that you could be with us today. And it's especially great to kick off the week with this sense of urgency about what are we going to do now? What is the transatlantic relationship going to look like? There are challenges that Europe and the US are facing, no question, many of them. And how are we going to come together? Where are the points where we're going to, where do we need to talk about? What do we need to do? What's the plan? And this, I hope that you checked out the readings on the website. I'll post it again in the chat so you can have a look and you can really see not only Ambassador Ruge's intention, but those of his colleagues who are eager and committed to making the transatlantic relationship work. So Ambassador Ruge's talk today is called "We Must All Hang Together, Transatlantic Relations in a New Era of Geopolitics." And it comes from a quote, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately." Benjamin Franklin. And again, this sense of we got to get this together. We got to make it work. And we're stronger together. And we'll get so, there's so many questions I have, and I'm sure you do too. And this is really the point of today. Ambassador Ruge will give his part of the talk and then really is eager to get into discussion with all of you. So please get your questions ready. You can gladly type them in the chat, but you can also, we're happy to have you ask your question directly. So please type in the chat that you'd like to ask a question or raise your hand and I'll do my best to navigate all the boxes. Okay, great. So I'm just going to introduce Ambassador Ruge, who is currently the Vice Chairman of the Munich Security Conference, the Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz. And he's been in this position since August 2019. And directly prior to that, he was Deputy German Ambassador to the US, which is when we were able to have Ambassador Ruge in Chapel Hill a few times during his tenure. So we can't wait to have you back in person. At least you're here via Zoom today. He previously served as the director of the Middle East North Africa desk at the Foreign Office in Berlin and as German ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Having joined the Foreign Service in 1989, much of Ambassador Ruge's career has been focused on security policy and stabilization. He worked at NATO headquarters in Brussels during the Kosovo air campaign and later served as chief political advisor to 2 successive commanders of the Kosovo force and as head of the political department at the Office of the High Representative in Bosnia-Herzegovina. At the Foreign Office, he was also in charge of European security and defense issues. And here comes the best part. Following undergraduate studies at the University of Cologne, Ambassador Ruge received a master's degree in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is a fellow Tar Heel on a Fulbright scholarship and also holds a diploma in international relations from the Bologna Center at Johns Hopkins and was a participant in the Royal College of Defense Studies in London course. He is married and has 4 children and lives in Berlin. It is so great to have you with us. Boris, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thank you and your team for organizing this event. It's great to be in Chapel Hill, or at least on the screen. For the sake of transparency, I should perhaps say that I'm still a member of the German Foreign Service, on loan to the Munich Security Conference. But whatever I say today here in this event is my personal opinion rather than an official German government view or the view of the Munich Security Conference. Maybe I can start with a few personal remarks, if I may. Without exaggeration, I would say that my 2 years at UNC at the history department were the most important building block in my university education. And I hope no one from Johns Hopkins is listening right now. But that's a fact. I owe a huge debt to the Fulbright Commission and to the history department and to Gerhard Weinberg, who may or may not be familiar to some of you listening, who was my advisor in the history department, spent several decades there as a professor of German and European history, and I think is now 93, still living in Chapel Hill. Less than 2 years after I graduated from UNC, I became a German diplomat, as you mentioned, Katie, in May of 1989, to be precise. And that, of course, was 6 months before the Berlin Wall came down, which taught me a few things about strategic surprise and odd turns of history, because in May of 1989, there was no one in the German government who thought that this kind of thing was about to happen, but it did. In the 32 years I've spent in government service, US-German relations and the Transatlantic Alliance have always been key elements of my work, whether it's been on the Middle East or on the Balkans or on security policy. That's always featured very prominently. While I was in Washington, D.C. as Deputy Ambassador back in 2017, then Secretary of Defense Mattis put out the National Defense Strategy, the NDS. And in that document, he put the importance of alliances and allies front and center. I think it would be fair to say that President Trump's heart was not necessarily in this, but the US military, the State Department, and both Republicans and Democrats in the US Congress, you could say, kept the faith and stuck with the Transatlantic Alliance and kept it going. And I'm very glad to say that the Biden administration, in the first 100 days that we're now approaching, has taken exactly that approach. It has put a very high priority on maintaining strong alliances. Allies, as you may or may not know, can be a real pain. They don't always do what you want. They have a mind of their own. They don't necessarily take on their fair share of the burden. But fact is, without allies, without Europeans, Japanese, South Koreans, Australians by your side, America would be weaker and less safe. I think that's a key element of foreign policy, of US foreign policy, and it's good when that's recognized. Round about 6 weeks ago, or 7 weeks ago at this point, President Biden spoke at an event of ours, which was sort of a replacement of our annual flagship conference in Munich on the 19th of February. It was called Beyond Westlessness, Renewing Transatlantic Cooperation. So let's look for a second at what is Westlessness and how do we renew the transatlantic partnership. My starting point is with the security landscape as seen from Europe and Germany specifically. It's evolved in a big way over the past 20 years. Consider the following points. President Trump called into question America's role in Europe as a key security provider. Brexit and developments in Hungary and Poland have made clear that the EU is not necessarily an ever closer union, and that it is subject to a great deal of tensions. Russia has not integrated into what we like to call the rules-based order, and in fact is actively working against the fundamentals of that rules-based order. The rise of China is having an impact on the global balance of power, and China is making its influence felt all the way to Europe, including the European Union. In our neighborhood, in our European neighborhood, there are a lot of trouble spots. Think of the Middle East and North Africa, but also Sub-Saharan Africa. Think of Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine at this moment, where Russia is deploying significant military forces threatening Ukraine. At the same time, European countries are experiencing significant internal challenges. populist parties, nationalist movements, social tensions, what people feel is rising inequality, a somewhat problematic demographic, i.e., an increasingly aging population on the one hand, and migration on the other, which some people feel is threatening our way of life on the other hand. And add to that the COVID-19 pandemic, and that creates quite a mix. These phenomena are not particular to Europe. The West in general, including the United States, is experiencing similar phenomena. And this is exactly what we have described as Westlessness, a term we coined back in 2020. And by Westlessness, we mean internal challenges of the West, such as reference, so challenges to democracy and the rule of law within our countries, a lack of unity within the West, so between Western countries. Think of the disagreements between the Trump administration and quite a few European countries over the past years. And finally, a relative decline of the West due to the rise of other powers, first and foremost China. Take as a metric China's increasing GDP, or its increasing share of global GDP, its increasing technological capabilities, its military power and its ability to project military power. Back in 2020, when we put this out as a term, some people felt we were quite wrong. The analysis was too harsh. Then Secretary of State Pompeo in Munich in February of 2020 actually said the West is winning. You guys have it completely wrong. But the developments, certainly up to January of this year, would seem to have vindicated a good part of our analysis. And some of you may disagree, but I think many people in Europe would say that the events of 6 January in Washington, D.C., the storming of the Capitol, represent one of those moments, essentially symbolizing the challenges to the West from within and without. So how do we address these issues? How do we move beyond Westlessness, to stick with that title of ours? How do we keep the Transatlantic Alliance going? At the 19 February event I mentioned, President Biden said, America is back, the Transatlantic Alliance is back. And those words were very much appreciated. President Biden and his team have placed international cooperation, alliances, and partnerships at the center of the foreign policy they put forward. And it's not just rhetoric, I would say. It's also underpinned by a series of measures taken by the administration. But at the same time, it's clear that we can't just go back to the good old days. The days before Trump, perhaps, the early 2000s, whatever you want to take as a reference point. The US is increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific. I think that is a view shared by Democrats and Republicans, very concerned about China. American voters seem to be increasingly skeptical of US global engagements, certainly if allies don't do their part. And then, of course, there's a number of disagreements between Europeans and Americans, not just on defense spending, but on things such as energy policy. Think of Nord Stream 2, the famous gas pipeline, or rather notorious gas pipeline, I should say. Lots of trade issues out there. We did not manage in the Obama administration to agree on TTIP, the trade and investment agreement between Europe and the US. There's lots of issues also on the digital economy, including data privacy and taxation. So it's not easy. We have a real challenge there. But I think it's important to remember that all these points of contention need to be looked at as part of a bigger picture, put differently, whatever divides us, our differences pale in comparison with what we have, in terms of disagreements with Russia and China. As I see it, the Biden administration presents a huge opportunity to put the transatlantic relationship on a new and more solid footing, and not just for the next few years, but in the long term. That's what we should look at. And I think the key question is, will Europe be able to use this momentum? Will it seize this opportunity? You could also say President Biden and the people he's brought in are probably the most transatlantic bunch of people likely to govern the United States of America in the foreseeable future. We're gonna have to be extremely lucky to have people with a more pro-European, more transatlantic outlook in charge in the executive branch of the US government. So we really have to make something out of this situation. Together with a group of colleagues back in January, around the time of the inauguration, we published a report called More Ambition, Please, which essentially is a manifesto calling on Germany and Europe to invest into the transatlantic partnership and to put the partnership on a new footing. What are the issues on which we need to cooperate? For a strong transatlantic alliance, obviously, security remains important. The US has been a key security provider for many decades. Europe still faces a significant threat from Russia, and we need the US by our side to deal with that. But the analysis is that in order to keep the US engaged on security matters, on defense matters in Europe, Europeans and specifically Germans need to do more, need to live up to the promises that we made within NATO on several occasions, defense spending moving up towards 2%, more in terms of investments, and so on. That's something where we have moved forward. Germany has increased its real defense spending by 40% since 2014. That's not insignificant, but to be honest, it's not enough still. Overall, Europe needs to become a more capable geopolitical strategic actor. It needs to do so not in order to replace the US, but in order to keep the US by its side. Europe needs to become a stronger partner to the US in European security and defense, but also in other areas to keep the US engaged. On China, probably one of the most difficult or the most difficult challenge for a common transatlantic approach. Secretary Blinken recently called China the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. And again, I think that is shared not just by Democrats in the US Congress, but also by Republicans. There's a very broad consensus on that. Now, increasingly, China is also seen as a competitor and even a systemic rival here in Europe. It's a discussion that's been going on for the past few years, but of course, we're coming from a different place. We're coming from a situation where China was seen first and foremost as a business opportunity, as a partner in trade and investment. I think in a number of areas and with regard to a number of European countries, there's a level of dependency that has come about, which makes a more confrontational, more robust policy towards China quite challenging. So we have to come together with the US on China, no doubt, but that's a challenging one and perhaps an area we should discuss. Technology is another area on which we need to work together. It's become an arena for geopolitical competition as well. And here, for the United States and Europe, there are several things that are important. One is setting standards. China has taken a big role here with its combination of state and party and business entities playing a role. But in fact, the US and Europe are still very significant players in terms of innovation, including in the digital sphere. But we need to stay in the competition in terms of defining these standards. We also need to come together on these digital flows across the Atlantic. Sharing data is absolutely crucial when it comes to an area such as artificial intelligence. It depends on the availability of data, so we have to work through those differences of opinion. Europeans and also Germans extremely sensitive on data privacy, the US coming from a different place. We have to work through those issues and really come together so we can share data and information and keep in the game as well. Climate is a massive and still underestimated challenge. We talk about it a lot, but I still don't believe that we have quite registered how important it is, including as a hard security issue. So we need close coordination here. We have a G7 meeting coming up. We have the COP26 Conference of Parties meeting coming up in the United Kingdom in November. We have a sort of a comprehensive US approach by the Biden administration. We have a European Green Deal on the part of the European Commission. Bringing those things together and working together will be key. And obviously, working together on fighting the pandemic and jumpstarting the economy will be crucial as well. Back at the 2017 Munich Security Conference, Bill Gates gave a very remarkable speech. Obviously, Bill Gates has been engaged in this issue of pandemics and vaccinations for many years. And if you go to back to that speech, you can find it on our webpage. It's remarkable how close the scenario that Bill Gates described then is to what we've been experiencing since early 2020. But we were not prepared. And we're paying a price for that. And I think the lesson we need to take from this is that we need to be prepared for the next pandemic because the next one will come, and we need to get a handle on this in terms of early warning, in terms of fighting it, in terms of supply chains, and so on and so on. And also, Europe and the US need to work together, not just to vaccinate themselves, so to speak, but to vaccinate the world. That's a big deal. And I would say right now in Europe, there's a somewhat critical view towards the United States, which has been very good at rolling out vaccines, getting people vaccinated, but has not exported vaccines so far. The European Union has been quite poor in some regards, vaccinating its own people, but it's been fairly generous in terms of exporting vaccines. And Germany in particular has been good in financing a scheme called COVAX, which is about providing vaccines free of cost to developing countries in particular who cannot afford to vaccinate their own people. But it's crucial that we vaccinate people around the world, because otherwise we'll have all these mutants which will come back and will hurt us badly. So those are some of the areas on which we need to come together. And Katie, you mentioned my favorite Benjamin Franklin quote there. We must all hang together, or we shall all hang separately. Benjamin Franklin, obviously talking at the time of the American Revolution, talking to his fellow revolutionaries. And that's sort of the way it is today for us as transatlantic partners. I sometimes feel that people look at diplomacy, foreign policy, and these things as a kind of luxury. It's something that you need to do. But in our day and age, I think the essence of foreign policy is to defend our way of life. That sounds sort of grandiose, but I think it's true. It's about defending democracy, the rule of law, open societies, market economies. Because there's players out there, Russia and China are perhaps the most significant, but there's others as well, who are threatening these fundamentals of the Western consensus. And so we need to defend our way of life. We're not going to be able to do that unless we team up. That means we need to work through differences which exist between the United States and its European allies. I think we can do so. And I think if we stick together, we have the capacity to defend these fundamentals and to continue as democracies based on the rule of law, with open societies, with tolerance, with market economies in the future. If we fail to stick together, I think we're in for trouble. So with that, back to you. Thank you for your attention. I hope we can discuss a few of these ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's really, it's quite a lot, isn't it, on everyone's agenda these days. And so to all those in the audience, please start putting your questions in, raise your hands. Let's get the discussion going. Great, I see one already coming in. I think you have done such an amazing job of putting all of the problems we're facing very succinctly. And yes, the big question is, how do we get into the details? Which steps do we take? And so I know you'll be covering more of that. Okay, Bob Jenkins, your hand is up.
All right, thank you, Katie. Thank you, Ambassador. It's a great list of issues to address. I teach an advanced undergraduate and TAM course on transatlantic security, so we cover a number of these issues in class, including tomorrow we'll be discussing transatlantic relations with Russia, so very timely on most of these issues. One of the highlights of the course, though, is not necessarily the transatlantic relationship, but the problem of European unity and will. I was wondering if you could address that briefly, just to get us started on a slightly different direction.
Happy. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. So I think European unity is crucial to this whole thing. When there's two vehicles basically for this transatlantic partnership to work. One is NATO, the United States and Canada as North American partners, and then European countries, most of whom are also members of the European Union on the European side, but obviously some are not in the European Union, like the UK, Norway, Turkey, and others. On the other hand, it's the United States of America and the European Union working together on trade in particular, on issues such as internal security, homeland security, you would say. So for the transatlantic relationship to work, you need a functional European Union. And this, of course, was US policy from 1947, if we take the Marshall Plan as the starting point, up to the Trump administration. I think President Trump and his administration is probably the first example of a US government deciding that European integration was actually a bad idea. President Trump famously said European Union was created to take advantage of the United States. Ironic, in my opinion. I wrote my master's thesis on US diplomacy and the role the United States played in the creation of the European coal and steel community, the first element of European integration. And of course, it was the exact opposite. Without the United States of America at the time, this would never have happened. Without the Marshall Plan, it would not have happened. And despite all the misgivings the United States has had over decades with the European Union, and there have been a few, at the end of the day, on balance, American governments have felt that it was better to have a European Union that was able to stick together, that was able to be a partner to the United States. One of the links that Katie, I think, put on the page a few weeks ago was an op-ed that I wrote with my boss called, what was it called? For Europe, it's a question of survival. It's something we wrote almost exactly a year ago. It was published in El País in Spain, in La Stampa in Italy, and in Die Zeit in Germany, written at a time when the pandemic hit Spain and Italy particularly hard, and where those two countries felt that they were not being sufficiently supported by the rest of the EU. So the point was basically, we have to get this thing right. Both in terms of addressing the immediate emergency, the pandemic, but also in terms of economic recovery. And if we don't do that, the European Union is in serious trouble. I think we sort of came around, number one, on fighting the pandemic, supporting the Italians, the Spanish, the French, and others, all of us. And then we agreed on a very significant recovery package in the middle of 2020. Historic because it gives the European Union the capacity to raise money for this recovery fund, rather than just working through member states. So I think we passed the test in a sense. Now there's a constitutional court thing going on in Germany, but I think we'll get past that as well. So I think the European Union, despite all the challenges, has somehow scraped through, and I think it will continue to do so. But obviously there's a difference between scraping through and being a geopolitical player. The ambition of this European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, German politician, is to be a geopolitical player. I think in that regard, we're not where we need to be. And I think we need to step up, Germany in particular, and that's part of the argument in another paper to which you'll find the link on the page. Germany needs to play more of a role, sort of move outside of its comfort zone a little bit for the European Union to be able to do that. But so absolutely, European cohesion and a capacity to act is absolutely fundamental, and it's fundamental to the transatlantic partnership as well.
I don't want to monopolize, but just as a follow-up to that, you mentioned the recovery fund, but of course that was a very difficult negotiation that involved Hungary and Poland disputing the rule of law mechanism. So there are other internal challenges that I think the union faces as well.
You're quite right, absolutely. I'm not going to list all of them because it would go on too long, but I think it's a reflection of the challenges we face. I think the challenges in many ways are similar in the United States and Europe. One of the biggest issues out there is migration, right? Migration is still a huge challenge to Europe, and from what I can see, the situation on the US-Mexican border is still extremely political, is very emotional for people, and feeds into a certain type of politics that makes government a real, effective government a real challenge, which is not, and I would not dispute. It's easy to say this is all about populism. I think that's too simple, right? There's a real challenge getting this right. And I would say the challenge is in some ways not so different between the European Union and the United States on the other hand.
Great, thank you. What is the position of the EU with respect to the independence of Taiwan from China? Is it aligned with the US position?
Mm-hmm. I think it's quite similar to the US position. We have something that is a one China policy, and it's probably different across the 27 EU member states. There's not one EU policy on this matter, but I think for the most part, the idea is that we recognize the People's Republic of China. We accept that Taiwan and China belong together. Most of us, I think, would violently dispute the notion that China has the right to use force to bring Taiwan back into the fold, if you like. And the U.S. policy, the U.S. One China policy, is again perhaps slightly different, but I think it's similar in that sense. It's evolving. I think Taiwan is also getting more attention in Europe for a number of reasons. One reason is that the People's Republic of China has been increasingly aggressive, has been talking about bringing Taiwan back in, has been sending aircraft across the median line in the Taiwan Straits, has been undertaking naval operations around Taiwan, and so on. That's one element. The other element is that people have noticed that Taiwan did quite well during the pandemic. A third element is perhaps that people have become increasingly aware that Taiwan is a significant provider of technology, specifically semiconductors. And so the upshot is that people are paying more attention. There was a hearing in the Human Rights Committee of the German Parliament, the German Bundestag, not long ago, with a video link to a government minister in Taiwan. So that's the kind of thing that perhaps a few years ago would not have happened. So I think it's increasingly on the agenda, and it's partly on the agenda because Beijing has taken a much more aggressive approach towards Taiwan. And also, perhaps I should add, because it plays into the whole issue of the South China Sea, where our international legal view is not in line with that of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you. If you could please elaborate further on how data security policies in Germany/the EU differ from those in the US. So a little bit more about GDPR, and that would be great.
So I'm not a huge expert in this regard, but Germans in particular and Europeans in general are super sensitive on data protection issues. And 2 times around, the United States and the European Union came to agreements on data privacy. And in both cases, those agreements were basically brought down by the European Court of Justice because individuals challenged these agreements under European law, and the European Court of Justice agreed that there was an issue. So we're again in this situation where we need an EU-US agreement on data privacy. GDPR, which is, remind me in English, Katie, the General
Directorate on GDP privacy, and oh my gosh, General
Directive on Data Privacy
Protection Regulation. Sorry,
okay.
General Data Protection Regulation.
General Data Protection.
I haven't said the long version in so long.
So I think in Germany it's GDSVO if you want to, if you're interested in acronyms. So that's an interesting case because this GDPR has become a bit of a global standard, in part because there is no US equivalent, at least no US equivalent that would cover all 50 states. During my time in DC, I remember visiting Washington State, and the State Assembly was working on legislation for a Washington State equivalent on data privacy. And I remember that that California was working on something like this because the US Congress had not adopted legislation. And so in a sense, the EU regulation backed up by 500 million consumers in the European Union and the digital single market that we more or less have, was a standard that the European Union was able to bring into play. But people over here are a lot more sensitive about data privacy, and that I think that's a reflection of our relationship with the state, specifically in Germany. But it's something that we have to navigate. We have to come to an agreement where we can share data, because if we don't, I think we give up the advantage of a transatlantic digital marketplace that is beneficial in terms of the trade, the business relationships, but it's also a disadvantage in terms of research and development on artificial intelligence specifically.
Thank you. Your position on the recent investment agreement that the EU Commission signed with China.
Excellent question, Philip. So this was an agreement that was, I think, initialed or signed, I'm not quite sure, in December between the European Union and the People's Republic of China. It is subject to ratification by the European Parliament, possibly by national parliaments as well. I'm not quite sure. I ought to know, but certainly the European Parliament. It was quite controversial at the time because many felt that we had not achieved enough in the negotiations with China on investments, and specifically in the area of labor standards. Now, others, including those responsible in the German government, felt that what they had achieved went farther than anything that the Chinese had agreed to previously. Those negotiators also argued that essentially this agreement was the equivalent to the Phase 1 agreement between the United States of America and China, put into place under the Trump administration. So we were essentially leveling the playing field. So depending on where you're coming from, there's different, you can have a different take on this. One of the issues was certainly that the Biden administration sent signals, and this was before inauguration, so when Biden was not yet in office. But his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, or his designated national security advisor at the time, basically sent a message saying, it'd be great if we could talk about this once we're in office. And the Europeans went ahead anyway. But again, I think among the people who are specialists on this, the trade and investment experts, there was not so much surprise. I think politically it was more problematic. I think there was a sense for some within the Biden administration that Europe should have waited. If we turn to where we are right now, it's interesting because what has happened in the meantime? In the meantime, round about 3 weeks ago, the European Union, for the first time since 1989, since the Tiananmen situation, imposed sanctions on China, specifically sanctioned a number of entities, and I think 5 sort of second-tier Chinese officials. In response, Beijing then sanctioned EU institutions, 5 members of the European Parliament, a German think tank, and other individuals. So Chinese came back in a big way, basically sent a message that they were not going to take this lightly. But in the process, it's not clear to me whether they thought about this or not. Sanctioning members of the European Parliament, basically, I think, has sunk the scenario of this investment agreement being ratified by the European Parliament anytime soon. The Parliament, as I understand it, is insisting that these sanctions on those 5 members be lifted before ratification can go ahead. I don't think China is going to lift those sanctions easily. So they've gone into confrontation mode, and quite possibly this investment agreement will be a victim of that, or will stay in this kind of halfway house and not go ahead.
Thank you. Christiane Lemke is with us today, and you're asking a question along the same lines. Would you like to unmute and follow up?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's great to see you again, Mr. Ambassador. We were on a panel just a few weeks ago in Hanover, Germany, on trade relations and the transatlantic relationship. So it's great to see you again, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Following up on your remarks on the EU-China agreement, I think it's very significant, like you said, that China put sanctions on EU Parliament members. And this is really hurting the prospect of ever ratifying it anytime soon. I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about this perception of China in Europe and in Germany in particular, because I feel like the US has much earlier realized the competition with China is really not only about, economic and technology development, but there's also a political component. Today, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung published an article in Germany about how China is trying to become a military power, stronger than the US, right? And I mean, that's really significant. So what is your assessment of the European / the German perception of China? Is it changing? Is it still the same because we want to do business? Maybe you can, comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiane. Very nice to hear your voice. And this was an event co-hosted by the American Chamber of Commerce in Germany, where Christiane and I spoke, and obviously we talked about our Chapel Hill connection.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Obviously, always advertising UNC Chapel Hill wherever we go. So your question, Christiane, is an excellent question. Let's start on the American side. I think that people have obviously different opinions about President Trump, but I think if we take a sober look at China policy over the past years, we can say that it was during President Trump's time that the US changed China policy in a big way. And as far as I can see, it seems that the Biden administration is on many points going to stick with President Trump's much more confrontational approach. And I think that is a policy that is backed by Democrats and Republicans alike in the US Congress. I'll give you an example from February 2020 when Vice President Pence spoke at the Munich Security Conference. Rather Secretary Pompeo spoke there. Pence was 2019. So Secretary Pompeo, 2020, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, but also Nancy Pelosi speaking at the Munich Security Conference. And Nancy Pelosi being asked specifically, this was with regard to Huawei and 5G, do you agree with the approach of the Trump administration? And she said yes. Yeah. So we can, during President Trump's time, there was a shift in China policy. And I think you're exactly right, Christiane, that we are going through that same discussion. We're possibly a little bit behind the curve in some ways, but it's also a reflection of our relationship with China, which for some European countries is quite a close relationship in terms of trade and investment. The Chinese have invested a lot, not just in terms of finance into European businesses, but also have invested politically. Among other things, they have created a format they call 17+1. So 17 European countries, some of them members of the European Union, some of them not, in Central and Eastern Europe, meeting with China in this format, which is really very remarkable. And China in that format uses its economic power, its capacity to invest, to create jobs in countries, to gain leverage. And that's, I think that's perfectly legitimate from their point of view, but it's not necessarily what we would like to see. If we look at Germany, I think we can say that across mainstream parties, the Conservatives, the Liberal Party, FDP, the Greens, the Social Democrats, we have a discussion on China policy that is going on. And within the self-same parties, we have very different opinions. And you'll find people that are very attached to not rocking the boat, maintaining a strong relationship with China because they're focused on the business and economic ties. And you'll find people who are concerned about China as a competitor and as a systemic rival who are saying we need to take a much tougher approach. And if need be, we need to make sacrifices in the area of these business relationships. That's going on. Last year, in summer of 2020, the Social Democrats in the German parliament put forward a paper describing their sort of outlook on China policy. And they used three terms that are part of an EU document from 2019, saying that, yes, China is a partner in some areas and a competitor in other areas and a systemic rival in yet another set of areas. But these Social Democrats say, at the end of the day, the fact that China is a systemic rival defines the overall relationship and limits the space for cooperation. So to me, that's an indicator that we are moving in Germany and in other European countries towards a more sober, a more skeptical view of what China represents, and a recalibration of these considerations. And that is where Taiwan comes into the picture. That is where Hong Kong comes into the picture. And that is why, for the first time since 1989, so what's that? That's 32 years. For the first time in 32 years, the European Union is sanctioning China over the situation in Xinjiang, the repression, the mass repression of the Uyghurs. So it's an ongoing discussion, and it's an extremely important element of the transatlantic relationship. You could say that China is the prism through which the United States looks at Europe. Or to put it differently, the United States will judge Europe to a large extent on the willingness of Europeans to move towards the US approach on China, rather than insisting on the approach that we've had so far.
That is a very interesting way, that prism. That is, that we're gonna have to watch out for that. How can we realistically expect EU-US cooperation to succeed when the US Congress is so severely divided and dysfunctional? The same pressures that have created this dilemma in the US also exist within the EU. What can be done to minimize outsized right-wing influence?
So, any European diplomat who's worked in Washington understands that there is such a thing as a second co-equal branch of government called the US Congress. So It's not just the executive branch. It's also the US Congress that is a very important actor in foreign policy. And at times is a counterweight. And I think it would be fair to say that in the Trump years, the US Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, were somewhat of a counterweight to President Trump, who repeatedly called into question America's commitment to NATO, the validity of Article 5 of the NATO treaty, i.e. collective defense, the relationship with the European Union, and so on. Republican and Democratic members of the US Congress, I think, came out time and again and backed up this transatlantic relationship. Again, Munich Security Conference 2019, largest ever US congressional delegation with 55 members, senators and congressmen and women attending. 2020, not quite as many, but round about 45, I think. So a huge turnout. And why did these senators and members of the House turn up in Munich? Because they wanted to send a message that this US-European relationship is absolutely crucial, and they want to keep it going, even if President Trump looks at it differently. I think that's the right way to interpret this. So I think the US Congress, in many ways, has been a real pillar of support for this relationship. Right-wing influence. So I would say in Europe, certainly, we do have right-wing parties increasingly playing a role. Certainly in Germany, we have the Alternative for Germany, AfD, playing a role. They had their party congress over this weekend. Their platform calls for Germany to leave the European Union, to stop migration, pretty much, all sorts of other things. They're a pretty unpleasant bunch of people. I think many of their voters are conservatives, but some of their voters are extreme right-wing, and many of their members and leading figures are right-wing extremists as well, which is why they are being observed by our internal intelligence agency. Because they're seen as a problem, as challenging the fundamentals of our constitution. And in other European countries, of course, you also have right-wing parties playing an important role. Think of France, the National Front. We have presidential elections coming up in France next year, and the leader of the National Front, Mrs. Le Pen, is going to give President Macron a real race for his money, I think. It's going to be a very tough competition. But of course, we have parties on the extreme left as well that are very problematic. So I think the key is to make sure that you have a kind of spectrum of parties on the center left and center right who are responsible, who are willing and able to work with each other, and who agree on some of the fundamental norms. And obviously, in the United States, there have been some challenges here, and I mentioned the storming of the Capitol on 6th January, which was a dramatic moment. You know, we haven't seen quite the same thing. We had some, demonstrations and some violence around the German parliament, not at this level, but I think we all observed what went on in Washington and imagined that something similar could happen here, and are trying to take precautions and figure out how to avoid increased polarization. That's really the key thing. One of the stabilizing elements in Germany, I think, is that we have public broadcasting, and many people get their news from a public broadcasting system, which is sometimes boring, but more fact-based and less polarizing than many of the news programs that are available in the United States of America. And that create less, of an echo chamber on this side of the divide or that side of the divide. I think that's been helpful, but polarization we have as well, in a very significant way.
Thank you. I'd like to just follow up briefly. I do agree that even though the public broadcasting is a little bit boring, I appreciate it that I don't get yelled at when I watch the news. This is a plus. But I'd like to follow up on this question, on Jeremy's question, because I think it's really important. And in your executive summary, you talk about how the US-EU relationship takes place in many channels. It's not just, as you say, the executive branch by any means. And we, as an academic institution, nonprofits, this civil society, these discussions play a role in this. And I think that it is really important as a citizen, as a voter, to be involved and to make clear the importance of the transatlantic relationship to your elected officials. And one way that is really important, that we see so much in North Carolina, and of course we have in our district very much support from Representative David Price, but this idea of European investment, right? So we in European, and whether you believe in intercultural dialogue and diplomacy, well, the money makes a difference, right? And so when you see the amount of jobs that are being created in North Carolina by European companies, the trade and investment piece is really critical and really does make a difference in terms of what elected officials are going to be supporting on both sides of the aisle. So I think it's also about framing the discussion and what will get folks to listen. So I think that I really appreciated you mentioning that it's all these different channels that play a role in strengthening the transatlantic relationship. Ambassador Ruge, you mentioned that Germany and Europe need to invest more in transatlantic partnership. Would you also say that Germany and other European countries have to invest more in a common security and defense policy in order for the EU to become a global player, or does this transatlantic relations, or do the transatlantic relations piece need to be prioritized?
So if you think back 20 years ago, under the George W. Bush administration, the US government was extremely skeptical of anything that the EU was trying to do in security and defense, because they saw it as competition to NATO. And I think over the years, people in the State Department, the Pentagon, the US Congress have become more relaxed, for one good reason and one bad reason. The good reason is, I think that they're more enlightened and that they see that Europe needs to have a capacity to take on certain security functions itself and rely less on the United States. I think that's a good reason. The bad reason, in a sense, is that their experience is that Europe does not live up to the ambitious rhetoric that it puts out. We had something called the Helsinki headline goal. I imagine few of you will have heard of that, but it was the idea that the European Union should be able to deploy up to 60,000 troops within 60 days for missions lasting up to a year. So fairly big operations, the kind of operations that NATO undertook in Bosnia and in Kosovo after the Balkan Wars. Europeans decided we should be able to do this even if the US is not willing or able to support us. We should be able to do this ourselves. And we're not, 20 years later, we're not there. So I think Americans have realized that, it doesn't always pan out quite in the big way that Europeans would like to imagine. A lot of European politicians talk about European armies, something that is very, very, if it's ever going to happen, it's in the distant future. But I think the good thing is that Americans are more relaxed, that they're willing to see Europe to play a role. And at the end of the day, people talk about something they call a single set of forces. So Germany has armed forces, and those armed forces are available to NATO, and they're also available to any EU missions. Those EU missions more likely are going to be peacekeeping or stabilization, and not so likely collective defense. So collective defense until today remains the core of NATO. And that's where I think the vast majority of Europeans feel we want to keep the US engaged. And if we don't have the US by our side, collective defense is not a credible proposition.
Thank you. If there are any last questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. I would love to ask about, I'd love your crystal ball thoughts about, what's brewing in Germany and France in terms of the elections. You touched on it. You mentioned it in your text that you sent us, and changes in Germany and France in terms of leadership are going to make a big difference here. And I'd love, I'm following a little bit what's brewing in Germany, and two people have said they'd step up if they were asked, so I'd love to hear your thoughts there. Of course, the AfD, Le Pen in France, and what's, what we need Germany and France to remain strong within the European Union. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So on the German side, we have national elections coming up in September of this year. And Angela Merkel will step down as chancellor after 16 years. And this is a situation that we have not had in the Federal Republic of Germany since the beginning. So it has never been the case that a chancellor has stepped down. Rather, chancellors before an election, right? Konrad Adenauer, our very first chancellor, stepped down in between elections, but it's a completely new situation that the incumbent chancellor is not running for office again. And so it's something, we'll figure out how that goes. It has created some turbulence in the Conservative Party. I think that's clear. If I were a betting man, I would bet that Armin Laschet, who is the chairman of the CDU, will end up being the candidate for chancellor of the CDU and the smaller sister party, CSU. But right now, there's two people in the running, Markus Söder, chairman of the CSU and prime minister in Bavaria, and Mr. Laschet, who is chairman of the larger CDU. The big trend that we've seen in Germany is that the predominant parties, the conservatives on the one hand, and even more the Social Democrats, have seen their share of the vote shrink. So Social Democrats in the last elections were down to 20-something, 23 or so, and now they're even farther. They're below the 20% mark in polls. The CDU was down to 32, I think, and now they're polling at 27. The Greens, on the other hand, have become stronger. The Liberal Party, the FDP, sort of market-oriented, sort of civil rights-oriented party, are polling around 10%. So right now, it's impossible to say how this will play out. I think the one thing that is very likely is that the Green Party will be part of the government coalition. The rest, I think, too early to tell. In France, President Macron has been in many ways a good partner to Germany, challenging because he's been wanting to develop the European Union, to make it a stronger foreign policy actor, to increase its ability to address economic and financial issues, including by raising funds itself. I don't know whether he's always had the response from Germany that his proposals deserved, but certainly people would be very sad to see him defeated by a far right-wing candidate. I think that would be a fundamental challenge to the Franco-German relationship and to the European Union as a whole, because far right-wing parties tend to be hostile towards the EU. And so we would find ourselves in new territory. I'm an optimist, so I'm somewhat optimistic that at the end of the day, Macron could pull it off and get himself reelected. But that's an election that is more than a year off, I believe. And again, it will depend on many things. As in the US, I think it will depend perhaps more on whether governments do a good job in terms of fighting the pandemic and restarting the economy. I think that will be the number one measure by which voters judge governments, rather than foreign policy and even defense, as long as governments manage to keep their people more or less safe and protected from outside attacks. I think the number one measure is really how do you do on the pandemic, how do you do on the economy, and that's what's going to get you reelected or not.
Thank you. I think that's a statement that goes for lots of places these days. Thank you. If there aren't any, are there any last questions? This has been really fascinating and really great to sort of get everything in perspective, and how, we can't treat all of these challenges in isolation. They all go together. We can't treat climate without looking at tech and trade and all of these different, and security, of course, and all these different things together. And I too am an optimist, and I'm hopeful for the transatlantic relationship, despite all the challenges. But I think, as you said, we have players at the table who are committed to keeping it strong, or to bringing it back. And we spoke about this before your talk today, that we can't go back to what things were like before. We can't just pretend the last 4 years didn't happen, or, because as you say, and many things did develop, and not all of it is to be dismissed. And we have a new playing field, and we have to deal with where we are right now. I think that you've made that really clear, and that's really important. Great. Well, please join me in thanking Ambassador Ruge. Let's see some, yes, let's have some reactions in this Zoom world we live in.
Thanks very much, Katie. Let me just say that it's a real pleasure to sort of be back, at least virtually, in Chapel Hill. I hope I can be back in person. Yes. And to me, this is really, it's heartfelt. It's something I feel very strongly about. And I will say this, people in Europe, and specifically in Germany, they have a lot of respect for America and a lot of affection for America, and they want this to work. And so I'm optimistic about this, but it's going to take some hard work as well. And these kinds of discussions, I think, are helpful to understand what we need to do, what differences we need to work through. So many thanks to you and your team for having me. Thanks for everyone who joined. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Stay well, everyone. Take care. And we hope to see you soon in person.
Thanks, Katie. All the best.
And to you. Take care.